Nik Matheou, a historian and political activist from the UK Boycott Turkey Campaign. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me, Adam.
Thank you. We are witnessing almost daily tensions in Eastern Mediterranean. Is a war likely to happen? What does this crisis result in?
So the tensions that we're currently seeing in the Eastern Mediterranean have been growing for a couple of years now. There's ever since the initial explorations were carried out in the Republic of Cyprus's sovereign waters and the discovery of hydrocarbons was made. What this has meant is that because of the Turkish state's occupation in the north of Cyprus and the unrecognized Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus's claimed territorial waters, the Turkish state has used this as a way in to claim some rights to some of these hydrocarbons. This tension was ramped up massively. However, there'd been a long history of militarized over the last couple of years, militarized drilling in the Eastern Mediterranean. So, in the same week that the invasion of northern East Syria happened last year, in the week beginning the 9th of October, the Turkish military also, in the Turkish Navy rather, entirely surrounded the island of Cyprus. So you have a clear expression there of the unity in the Turkish state's foreign policy, the way in which they used the cover of the invasion of northern East Syria to provide a cover for their circulation of Cyprus for hydrocarbons. But this year, the tensions have ramped up even further. It was especially with the deal made with the government in Tripoli in Libya for an exclusive economic zone which connects between Libya and Turkey. Now, anyone with any awareness of the geography of the Eastern Mediterranean can see that there are lots of islands in between Turkey in the north of the Eastern Mediterranean and Libya in the south, which should mean that these economic zones wouldn't meet up. And so in terms of a war, then, it's looking increasingly likely that some kind of military conflict is possible. In fact, I don't think that we can exclude the possibility of an all-out war between some or all of the actors in the region. Maybe we'll come a little bit further on, a little bit later on, we'll see exactly how these alliances are all linking up. But as well as an all-out war, I think the particular worry and the particular outcome that we shouldn't exclude and that we should try to guard against is the attempt to create new facts on the ground, both in Cyprus and in the Greek islands that Turkey claims, as well as, and there have already been frictions over the naval explorations attempted by Turkey and the defensive actions which the Greek state has put in place. So, for example, I could easily see the attempt to create new facts on the ground by the occupation of one or another of the islands that are unoccupied by people, unpopulated maybe is the better term, and that the Turkish state would send some forces to occupy this, to create new facts, to ramp up the tensions further. And I think earlier this year we saw a willingness from the Turkish state to do exactly these kinds of actions and to infringe on the sovereignty of the other states in its areas with the weaponization of refugee lives that was attempted in February and early March, where they essentially rounded up Syrian refugees and sent them to the border with Greece and used them as a proxy force to attack the Greek nation state. So I think we can already see a willingness to ramp tensions up, and we should be prepared for some kind of military conflict. I would say the least likely is an all-out military conflict between different powers, especially as both Greece and Turkey are NATO allies. But small points of friction, attempts to create new facts on the ground in terms of occupying different islands, all of this can't be excluded.
Thank you. Turkey continues hydrocarbon exploration activities and now takes declared open for the second time in Cyprus. So Greece and Cyprus says Turkey is violating maritime jurisdictions. So what exactly is the situation here? But very short, very briefly.
So very briefly, as I said, there's hydrocarbons that have been discovered in waters between Greece, particularly coming east of Crete, Cyprus, and then the Levant, Lebanon and Israel, Palestine. And so when these were discovered, there were agreements that were made between the Greek, Cypriot and Israeli states for the collective exploitation of these hydrocarbons. And since those deals, or as those deals were being negotiated, the Turkish state was making its own claims, both on behalf of the Turkish state and on behalf of the unrecognized and self-declared Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, which is essentially the result of the Turkish occupation from 1974.
Yes. Sorry, please.
So there's now essentially an alliance between Greece, the Republic of Cyprus, and Israel, again, in the Israeli state, against the Turkish state and the Turkish state's claims. And what the Turkish state has done in response is to make a deal with the embattled government in Tripoli, in Libya, which is in the middle of a civil war with General Haftar's forces, who are supported by Egypt, the Egyptian state, and arranged a new deal on the exclusive economic zone, so the area of the sea that is the exclusive right of a particular nation state. So that's the maritime jurisdiction. The Turkish state negotiated a new one with this embattled Libyan government in return for military support. So it's a very tense situation.
Yeah. How do you comment on the attitude of European countries and international institutions on Turkey's occupation and invasion of Cyprus as well as Kurdistan?
I mean, where to begin? It's a litany of hypocrisy and empty statements and unwillingness to observe the norms of international law. The Turkish state's initial invasion and occupation of Cyprus was tacitly approved by a number of European states, in particular the old colonial power, the United Kingdom, but also the leading force in NATO, the American state, and was tacitly supported in the context of the Cold War, in particular because of policies in the Cold War and Archbishop Makarios's non-aligned policies. And ever since then, there's been essentially a tacit agreement to the status quo, even after the entrance of the Republic of Cyprus into the European Union and Greece into the European Union. So there are some countries that are now starting to provide support both for the Cypriot situation and for the occupations in Kurdistan, particularly in Western Kurdistan, Rojava, northeast Syria. So I'm thinking in particular of Macron's government here, and the French Navy and French Army have been mobilized to support and to block the designs of the Turkish state. From Afrin, actually, already Macron was making some of these moves, but in general, the responses range from silence to, in the case of the British government, who are mainly thinking about a post-Brexit trade deal, to the hypocrisies of the German government, who are essentially, in practice, supporting the designs of the Turkish state. So really, what's needed are European-wide sanctions on the Turkish state and on particular actors in the AKP MHP regime. Without sanctions and without meaningful support from European institutions, and I don't necessarily primarily mean military support here. I don't think that a conflict is in anyone's interest at all. Our region has seen far too many conflicts, in fact, and nation-state conflicts. It won't bring a useful solution to anyone. But support in terms of economic sanctions, support in terms of development, and support in terms of making it clear that the Turkish state faces a united front against its illegal actions and against its frankly fascist and imperialist actions in the region, we won't be able to get anywhere.
How do you comment on the attitude and aggression of the Turkish state and Erdogan towards both Greek and Turkish Cypriots? Can you see similarities on these aggression against Kurds as well?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think we have to recognize some of the differences first. So Kurds within Turkey, but increasingly also in occupied areas of Kurdistan outside of Turkish borders as well, face a particular kind of violence from the Turkish state because they are trying to be assimilated into Turkishness. But in that regard, Turkish Cypriots are in a very similar situation. They're being encouraged to identify primarily with Turkey, to forget the particular identity and the particular culture of Turkish Cypriotness, or Cypriot Turkishness, whichever way you want to put it. And then in terms of the Greeks, both the Rum community within Turkey and the Greek populations in Greece and Cyprus, these populations are much more clearly othered by the Turkish state and its nationalist regime. But so there are some differences in terms of the Muslim populations in Turkish Cypriots and Kurds are being assimilated, whereas Greeks are more violently being othered. But in terms of the commonalities, it's very clear that it's the same pattern, and it's a pattern of colonialism within Turkish borders, colonialism in terms of expelling Greeks, and colonialism in terms of settling the north of Cyprus, often with people who could be termed refugees as well as settlers, which is the real criminality of this violence, right? It's a double violence. People are both being expelled from particular regions of Turkish borders, within Turkish borders, and then settled outside in the north of Cyprus. So there are lots of similarities here. And I think actually one thing that I would emphasize is the continuity. Yes, the Erdogan AKP MHP regime has intensified the violence massively in the last 5 years. But as we've seen, it's nearly 45 years since Cyprus was occupied and was partitioned. So this is a long process that goes to the essence of what the Turkish state represents, how it was set up, and what role that particular state plays in the region.
Both in Middle East and Eastern Mediterranean, Erdogan's aggression, growing tensions between Greece and Turkey, Egypt, Libya, Cyprus, and so on. So, what do you think Erdogan and AKP regime aiming? And what is your message to Turkey about their international policies?
So I think one thing that is important to say is that when we see a regime, of any political regime anywhere in the world, acting in this manner, where they're striking out on the one hand, invading northwest of Syria and occupying Afrin in 2018, invading northeast Syria in October last year, intensifying these actions in the Eastern Mediterranean against Greece and Cyprus, and in involving themselves directly in the Libyan civil war. There is the temptation to see this as all part of a coordinated plan. And to a certain degree, there is a coordinated plan, in that the perspective of Turkish nationalism since the establishment of the Turkish state is something called the Misak-ı Milli, which is the national pact, which incorporates borders going, envisions Turkish borders stretching far into modern day Greece, including Cyprus, and including large sections of northern Syria, northern Iraq, for Aleppo and Kirkuk. So there clearly is a general imaginary, nationalist, imperialist imaginary that the Erdogan regime is acting on, and we see this in their own electoral campaigns as well. So the MHP for the last electoral campaign released a map which included Cyprus as a part of Turkey. It was a map that had the MHP flag on it, and it had Cyprus there, the whole of the island. So clearly there is some sort of subconscious here, or an underlying of Turkish nationalism. But I think it's also important at the same time not to fall into the trap of seeing this as a carefully coordinated plan, because in some ways there we start to overestimate our enemy, and we start to and we forget where their weaknesses are. If we look back over this last year, every month has seen a new crisis. Every single month, from the refugees, well, initially with Libya, to the refugees, to the changing in the status of Hagia Sophia, from a museum to a mosque, now to the militarized drilling in the Eastern Mediterranean. Every month has seen a new crisis. And that is because, paradoxically, the AKP-MHP regime is also in a weak position. The Turkish economy is doing terribly, and they have dealt also, because of this, incredibly badly with the COVID crisis. The statistics that we have coming out of Turkey officially are completely unreliable. There's lots of evidence of people dying and of COVID and having it recorded as another as because of another cause. So these two crises, a long-term economic crisis and the immediate COVID crisis, are coming together to create an incredibly unstable situation. So the AKP-MHP regime is lashing out and drumming up nationalism in order to try and secure itself. And this is the sign of a weak regime. It doesn't mean that they're going to fall. And I don't mean, on the other hand, to underestimate them, but it means that they are in a weaker position than we realize. That could be a dangerous situation as well. The Assad regime is incredibly weak, but it doesn't mean that it's not causing incredible levels of violence and pain and suffering. So my message to the Turkish state, both in terms of its international policy and in terms of its domestic policy, and my message in particular to the regime, is we see how weak you are. We see that these actions aren't the actions of a regime in its glory days, but in its dying days. And if the regime doesn't attempt in some meaningful way to redress these problems, then it is going to fall all the more quickly. If it thinks that these domestic and foreign policies are ways to make itself stronger, it is sadly mistaken. It will only make itself weaker.
Mr. Öcalan is under isolation last 21 years now, and he is not allowed to meet his basic human rights. What is Turkish state aim by isolating Mr. Öcalan? Does Cypriot leftists support freedom for Öcalan?
So I think, yes, on the last question, Cypriot leftists support freedom for Öcalan. Absolutely, there's a dynamic solidarity movement in Cyprus itself, which I have friends as part of, and freedom for Öcalan is a key aim there. Not only freedom for Öcalan, but the delisting of the Kurdistan Workers' Party, the PKK, has been raised by the main Cypriot leftist party, AGEL, and the opposition. And I think many Cypriots, both in the diaspora and on the island, recognize that the liberation of our areas and the liberation of Kurdistan and therefore the liberation of Abdullah Öcalan are completely intertwined. In terms of why they're isolating him, it relates very closely to what I was saying before. What Mr. Öcalan represents, what the Kurdish freedom movement represents, and so what also the Kurdistan Workers' Party, as a key part of the broader freedom movement, represents, is a solution, is the possibility of a solution for the entire region. And that's something that I think people are starting to see more and more, not just Cypriots, but also Arabs in Syria. There's research coming out now that shows the extent to which the movement is being supported across Syria by people from different communities, Arabs of Sunni and Shia background. and other people from across the region are beginning to see that the solutions proposed by Mr. Öcalan from prison in some of the most desperate circumstances hold out the potential for a democratic society for all of us, and for a free life where we can start to develop equally, but in diversity. And so that's why they keep him isolated. They keep him isolated because despite all their attempts, whilst in prison, he managed to compose political works and present a political vision that has created a revolution within the revolution and created the incredible kinds of projects that we see on the ground today, yes, in northeast Syria, Rojava, but also across Kurdistan. And I think what their greatest fear is, and our greatest hope, is that those projects can be replicated across the region, from Libya and Greece, across modern Turkish borders, Cyprus, Syria, Egypt, and the entire Middle East. A renaissance of the Middle East is what Mr. Öcalan's vision promises, and what the Kurdish freedom movement is organizing to build. And that's why all of us in the diaspora or in the region itself should be supporting freedom for Öcalan, peace in Kurdistan, and the decriminalization of all parts of the Kurdish freedom movement.
So you are a Cypriot like myself, and you are in solidarity with the Kurdish movement, and you're running a campaign, Boycott Turkey campaign, which is seriously growing in UK. So could you please give us some detail about the Boycott Turkey campaign, and what's the main achievement, the main target for that campaign? Very short, very briefly, please.
So very briefly, the campaign has a broad aim, which is to grow a movement for boycott of particular Turkish goods tied to the regime, as well as tourism, to raise awareness and to create campaigns against the arms trade and international complicity with the Turkish military-industrial complex, and for academics and cultural workers to support a boycott of Turkish institutions, government-supported Turkish institutions and universities. And through this campaign to build as broad a united front as possible against the actions of the Turkish state and against the criminal and often fascist actors that are implementing those actions in the Turkish state and in the regime. I really encourage people to have a look at the website, to get in touch with us at boycottturkey@riseup.net, and to see how they can get involved. Because really, this is, as me sitting here saying this is a campaign for everyone in the region. Yes, the Kurds are at the hot point of violence of the Turkish state, but as we see increasingly now, it is an immediate concern for all the peoples of the region and all of the diasporas of those peoples, and really for world peace.
Dear Nik Matheou, a historian and political activist from the UK Boycott Turkey campaign, thanks for joining us again today. Thanks for supporting our channel.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to appear.